This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. We think about how we would like to get back at people, don't we? That's, you're insulted, you're humiliated, you're harmed in some way. Maybe something has been taken from you. This idea of making things right is ancient. It goes back even further than the Bible. The first time we see mention of it is through the Babylonians with, of course, the Code of Hammurabi. And what it comes down to is this idea of what's referred to as reciprocal justice. The back and forth, if you will. Today, we're going to talk about a fellow who just died in the death chamber in Alabama. And towards his end, he became a believer in Lex Talionis. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave, this case came across my desk, and I forwarded it to you because I thought that it was one of these cases that, well, first off, it happened, the actual murder that is involved here actually happened not too far away from where we are in the whole grand scheme of things. And it is arguably, and even our governor, who is goes affectionately, I think, by the term of Meemaw, Governor Kay Ivey, actually made a statement in regards to it. And just very briefly, just in a few words here, this is a direct quote from her when she was actually asked to grant clemency in this case. And she's referring to the victim, and she says, the murder of Tracy Wilemon was premeditated, gruesome, and disturbing. And tonight, the state carried out the death sentence of James Osgood. And this is coming from a woman the governor who had signed a death warrant on someone else this year so far, but she's also granted clemency to one person because she said she was not convinced of their guilt. It's not like, she's going out and saying that all 164 individuals on Alabama's death row, I'm going to make sure they're all put to death. She's doing a bit of reflection and examination, but I think that this is one of those events, this case in particular, is one of those that, again, here's that term that you hear associated with courts lots of times. It so shocked the conscience that she felt like that, it was time. It was time to put this to an end.
The thing about the death penalty being carried out on somebody who has become a believer ends up striking a chord with so many people, Joe. And I have to be really honest with you right here. I am a believer. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. And in that, I know that to be absent the body is to be present with the Lord. When my life ends here, I begin a new journey into eternity. And I've often wondered, when it goes back to Carla Faye Tucker.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And she was involved in this horrible murder, and she was sentenced to death. And when her death sentence was about to be carried out, there were protests. You had the 700 Club broadcasting from the prison pretty much. It was crazy within the religious world. And right. I kept thinking, if you truly believe what you claim to believe, you're going to paradise. So, carry out the sentence and let's move forward. I don't mean to be flippant about it, but I oftentimes think about the victim here. But I remember the this Carla Faye Tucker thing was huge, and it really hit me the wrong way.
I remember it. Yeah.
It just did.
Yeah, there's the old adage and this is very pessimistic on my part, but it's the old flippant. You used from the flippant adage that people find Jesus in prison, and the comeback is, I didn't know he was in prison, and so. And, the pessimist in you, you're always thinking that a scam is being run on you, to take you in or change the attitudes towards something. But I got to tell you, Dave, in this case with the perpetrator, and he admits to being the perpetrator, he doesn't fight against it. Osborne, what's so striking about this case, there's many things, but what's so striking about it is that he took a view of this, a rather Old Testament view of this, that he needed to pay for what he had done to this poor woman, who, by the way, I mean, the victim, and a lot has been written about her, I think. She's just trying to get her life back. She was divorced.
I'm glad you're pointing that out, about the victim trying to get her life back, because that is that's been running through this. She was born and raised in Riverside, California, got married. It was a bad marriage, but it did give her a daughter. And at 44 years old, she's in Clanton, Alabama. Think about it. That's a long trek from Riverside, California,
you're not kidding,
to Clanton, Alabama. It's about 50 miles north of Montgomery, about the same distance south of Birmingham. All right. And she's in there because her cousin has a job at this nursing home. And hey, I'll go. You know how when we're trying to start anew, we still need friends and family, and that's what happened. Yeah. So she ends up in Clanton near her cousin, Tony Van Dyke, and they're about the same age, and they're working at the same nursing home. Look, she started all over in her early 40s here. She started with nothing, Joe. I mean, the victim here started with did not even have a car. All right, so she takes this job at the nursing home. She's saving every penny. She actually buys a car. She's working on getting the money together to go out and get her daughter. I mean, she is really rebuilding her life.
Yeah, I think her daughter was out in
Lake Havasu, Arizona.
Lake Havasu. And she was, I don't know, trying to do some kind of reclamation here, I think, with her life, just trying to put things together.
Exactly. And she was on that path.
Yeah. And, look, I'm not saying anyone is deserving of any kind of violence, and there's no way you can grade it. I mean, how many people have we covered about the ends of their lives, on body bags where they didn't see it coming? I mean, death is that way. Evil is that way. You never, I think that some of us might say, we can judge people and say, well, you should have known that was going to happen. Yeah, maybe so. But, there are those cases, Dave, where people, they didn't know what was going to happen. They just happened to be in the wrong place, the wrong time, and evil visited them. And, you're struggling with your life. You're trying to get it back on wheels. And suddenly, I don't know, this person who has this, and it's been described as a very twisted fantasy, wants to act out with another perpetrator on Tracy.
Yep. And
and that's what, that's what's so absolutely horrible. This is not like she's been taken out in a field and, executed with a single shot to the back of the head. You're talking sexual deviance coupled with torture.
It comes from a friend, a family member. It comes from her cousin. That's the thing. Joe, how did they get into her house? Okay, she's living in her trailer park. She's got her single wide. She's got her life back together, as mentioned. And here comes Tony Van Dyke, her cousin. All right, that's something I cannot hammer home enough, because we oftentimes will not open the door to evil, because you see evil for what it is and you don't let it in. But in this case, evil came to her as a cousin she'd known her whole life.
Yeah.
As a cousin who actually was a part of her rebuilding her life.
Well, Dave, from a nuts and bolts perspective, as far as investigations and forensics go, I mention this all the time because we can't help ourselves when we're instructing people. No signs of forced entry or struggle, right? That's one of the things that we talk about. If we have like a death in a home, we're going to look around doorways and windows to see if anybody forced their way in. And Dave, one of the conclusions that we will arrive at, and it's very broad, you can't apply this every single time, but if you find a case that on its surface seems like a home invasion, but yet the door has not been kicked in, the window has not been jimmied in any way, there's this kind of broad assumption you start with where you say, this person was probably known to the individual that was domiciled here. So there's not some kind of resistance or fight, necessarily when all of this takes place.
Yeah, they were invited in. Come on in.
Yeah. Why it's not? Like, and it's kind of like, the old adage about a vampire. A vampire's not going to, not that they're real. However, there have been people that have claimed to be vampires, and we're going to have to cover some of those cases that have occurred over the years of people drinking blood. But in the true sense of, fictionalized vampires, the old adage about a vampire is not going to come into your house unless you invite them. They have to be invited into your home, crossing the threshold, if you will. And who sees this kind of thing coming, Dave? I mean, really, who sees it coming and can anticipate that when that door swings open, that this kind of fog of evil begins to seep in. And the one thing that it's looking for is your life. Can I tell you right up front, Dave? I don't like going to nursing homes. They've always given me the willies. I don't like them. I know that they're a necessity. And some people don't have a choice. They have to go into these places. And not only, I think, is it a difficult place to live, it's a very difficult place to work. Just think about what you're doing. You're taking care of individuals who are people go into nursing homes for a variety of reasons. They're not all aged, but the lion's share of them are. And you have to help and maintain at the most basic levels, everything, bodily functions, checking on, blood pressures and sugars, and making sure that they're going to go to the bathroom, making sure that they eat, all of those things, changing bed linens and rolling people in bed so they don't get bed sores.
I'm so glad you just said that, Joe.
Yeah.
Because do you realize what it's like to roll somebody over that is very heavy, and even though they are alive, they are dead weight. They're not helping. My sister-in-law actually ended up on disability from injuries suffered working in a nursing home. Because
not surprising,
constantly working. And I am, again, not complaining and not knocking them at all, but that's what happened to her. I kept thinking, what's going on with her? And that's what it was, because she was constantly having to maneuver people who couldn't help themselves, and it took its toll. But there's also, beyond the physical aspects of a nursing home, there's also the emotional, psychological, and mental. Because you have people that are sometimes put in a nursing home, and this is the saddest thing, and they're kind of kicked to the curb by family here.
Yeah, they are. That does happen. And so you have someone like Tracy that slips in, and isn't it interesting? You've got people that are at the end of their life. Maybe they have no one left in their life. Right. And Tracy is kind of in the same boat, with the exception here that she has a cousin that's actually employed with her. And I often wonder, did the cousin help her get the job?
Oh, I had to,
Joe. How are they going to wind up there together? You come here, it's a steady paycheck. You can get your life squared away, reestablish yourself, and we'll work on getting your daughter. And I think about that and think, wow, was that part of this game? Was this part of, and I wonder if this is the overarching theme here, Dave. Did this man that we've talked about, James Osgood, was this his plan? Had he orchestrated this in some way by having the utility, literally, of the cousin to draw someone in, almost like a moth to the flame, Dave?
I don't know. They've referred to it as a fantasy played out, and if it is that long game of evil, then you've got somebody who actually recruited. I'm talking about the cousin here, Tony Van Dyke, recruiting her cousin to come to Alabama from California, Arizona, wherever she happened to be, where she had family on the West Coast, getting her to come all the way to Alabama to start her life over, where the only person she knows is Tanya, And if they did this for the purposes of eventually living out this fantasy that led to the death of, that's like an evil at a whole new level. That really is. If Tracy Lynn Wilemon was actually recruited to come to Alabama when she's at the low part of her life trying to rebuild it, and her cousin reaches out and brings her here with hope, all because Tanya Van Dyke and James Osgood, nicknamed Taz, they had a plan, that would be an evil level I can't even imagine.
Yeah, and you talking about the long game here, had this, how much talk had there been between both of these perpetrators? One of now, of course, has died in the death chamber. This cousin, I'll go ahead and tell you right now, Kay Ivey the governor of Alabama has stated that this person is in federal prison, and she will, according to the governor of Alabama, she will never see the light of day. I wonder if that was part of their long game. If they, and they could in no way, I guess, have predicted that it could have gone like this. But how can you begin to dabble in this level of evil and not understand that there will be a consequence that you will pay? And of course, this man, Osgood, he actually did wind up paying with his life. But Dave, I want to go back in time and try to understand kind of the timeline of what went down here relative to this level of brutality that we've been told and have, kind of borne witness to through all of the reports that have come out about this case. That, by the way, like many of these cases, and we've done other death penalty cases before, Dave, remember our focus here is the victim now, okay? And isn't it interesting, like an old dusty bottle of wine, it's forgotten, somewhere far, far away. And the only time you hear about it again is when the individual that has been convicted is going to go to the death chamber. And even when that person is going to the death chamber, the victim, Tracy in this case, becomes almost like it's like a secondary issue to all this. I think it's important that we remember.
Well, that's why when we began looking at this story, many times when somebody's sentenced to death, the legal eagles come out of everywhere, to debate the death penalty. And taking that out of the equation, let's just get down to what actually transpired and what led to the conviction and what led to the sentence. In this particular case, you have, as I mentioned earlier, you've got Tanya Van Dyke, who is cousins with the victim here. And our victim, Tracy Lynn Wilemon, is going through a time in her life where she's now divorced, her child is not with her, and she is starting with nothing. She's working at the same nursing home as her cousin, and that's why I thought certainly she had to have been brought out. Hey, I've got a job for you. Come out here and let's start over. Come on. And I mean, I've done that. I've brought people from other states to work for me because I knew them. I trusted them. And come on, stay at my house till you get, your feet under you. Anyway, so we have Tracy Wilemon arriving in Alabama, working at the nursing home with her cousin, but she has her own place. She's got her a trailer in a trailer park. And in this particular case, James Osgood and Tony Van Dyke are a couple. They're in a romantic relationship, and they spend the first part of the day with Tracy Lynn Wilemon, just being together, family and friends. But during the course of the day, at some point in time, inside Tracy Wilemon's trailer, Tanya Van Dyke gets her, and they say coerced or talked her into going back to the bedroom somehow. I don't know what exactly that means, but somehow Tanya Van Dyke got Tracy to go back towards her bedroom in the trailer, and Osgood was right behind her. Osgood has a gun. And over the next several hours, they, being Van Dyke and Osgood, took turns raping at gunpoint Tracy Lynn Wilemon, a woman who is just getting her life back together. And here we go, holding a gun at her head, taking turns holding the gun, by the way. They actually, we don't need to go into the details. Y'all can figure this out. You know what happens when people are into a sexual fantasy where a man and a woman are taking turns holding a gun and forcing their victim to be involved in their entire sexual fantasy. At one point, Tracy said, I got to go to the bathroom. I need to use the bathroom. Well, just so you know, when they were cleaning up, feces and blood was found smeared on the victim's body, Joe.
Yeah.
She was degraded, beaten, and according to the prosecution, was being sexually attacked while her throat was cut. Yeah. And it wasn't cut once. There were several cutting marks on her neck. How does that happen, Joe?
Well, you have, I've seen cases with edged weapons where an individual will take a knife. And this goes back to a term that you and I have used before of menacing, which I love that term, by the way, as a descriptor, that you can actually kind of paint the picture and where you're placing a knife against someone's skin. And you're saying, if you don't do this, I'm going to cut you. Okay. And so my suspicion is that these incised injuries that she sustained were variable in depth. Okay. So you're going to have, you'll see these little abraded, we refer to them as curvilinear, and that's a weird word. I always thought, when I heard it for the first time, and of course it came from a forensic pathologist, I always thought, that out of all the terms that you guys use, this is one of the most made up terms I've ever had, because it has features of, okay, break it down for you, being curved and being linear, like straight lines. So
doesn't seem possible.
No, it doesn't. However, it is. And let me tell you why. If you have, let's just say someone takes the leading edge of a knife, okay, maybe even the tip of the knife, and they slice someone. Well, the biomechanical action of the wrist itself, as that blade is drug across the skin, will give it almost an arcing-like appearance, curva, and then it'll straighten out at the end, linear. Now, also on a, if you think of the neck as kind of a cylinder as well, the surface of the neck is not like, say, the surface of our chest, right? So you've got this cylindrical kind of shape that you're applying a straight edge blade to, and dependent upon, and trust me, the victim, and in this case is going to be Tracy, she doesn't want this. So she's going to be moving back and forth. So you can kind of get these real weird presentations of curvilinear insults that are generated from an edged weapon. Now, if she's resistant, now more force is applied. So you can go deeper, okay, as you press that blade. And a lot of it is dependent upon how sharp that blade is as well. So then you begin to drag the blade deeper as you're applying more pressure. Now, one of the interesting things here is that, if I am not mistaken, Osgood makes the comment during his trial or his admission that she was not dead yet. And so the idea that he's got to finish her off, and while he's having sex with her, as well as this cousin that's there as well, all the while, she's struggling, Tracy is, and those cuts are getting deeper and deeper until they get into the vasculature of her neck. You know, all of these structures that exist in our necks, and I'm talking about, you know, the carotids, the jugulars, but you know, there are other more superficial vessels that run through the neck too. You don't have to necessarily score a hit on a carotid, which, by the way, carotids are very deep. Okay. The carotid arteries are buried. You can do like a pressure. As a matter of fact, if you're taking someone's pulse, it's arguably one of the best spots to go to, you know, kind of adjacent there to the larynx, and you press down, you can feel your heart pumping like that, you know, and that blade was laying over the top of those vessels and over the trachea as well. Now, it has been said that Tracy's throat was actually cut all the way through. And one of the terms, and you know, this term has been thrown around for years and years, and sometimes it is a literal assessment, and that is the term that the throat has been cut from ear to ear. I've always thought, Dave, that term probably arose, I would think, with people that were butchering animals, because there's a utility to it. One of the most horrible places I've ever been in my life, I had to go to this place. I'm not going to go into it, but it was a case we were investigating. I had to go to a slaughterhouse where they kill pigs. And they would truss the pigs up, and they'd cut their throat. And literally, it is cutting from ear to ear. And the reason they would do that, they wanted to drain the blood, you know, out of the hog. And I've often thought that idea, that assessment of being cut from ear to ear, is something that probably came up in butchery. And you hear homicides many times, Dave, that where the homicides are described in terms of butchery. You know, it was pure butchery, you know, that we saw. And then I thought, well, maybe it came about as a result of executions. But no, I don't think so. I think that the term ear to ear probably came about as a result of people that were working in slaughterhouses, and they knew how to dispatch an animal. Just because you show up with a knife doesn't mean you know how to use it. But in addition to throat cutting, Tracy presents with multiple stab wounds as well. That's why there's a torture element here, Dave. You know, you've already run down the list of these horrific things that this poor woman was subjected to. You know, obviously sexual assault, the smearing of the body with bodily fluids, and the terrorism itself. I've had to live, when I was little, you know, me and my mother was a single mom, and we lived in a trailer. One thing I can tell you about a single wide trailer, you talk about being trapped, is as you're headed back, and generally the main bedroom is on the far end away from the kitchen in these things. And I know you've been in, if you haven't lived in one, which you probably have at some point in time, when you go down that hallway is a narrow pass. It almost looks like something you'd see on a ship. So once they've got you bottled up in that hallway, you ain't going nowhere, man. there's nowhere to hide. It's not like you can go into the basement or escape into the attic or go jumping out of a window. That's not the way it happened. So when they began to corral her and take her back there, they were showing up with bad intentions, Dave. I know you might find it surprising, but when you're a death scene investigator, you do have there are moments and times where you'll have a visceral reaction. And I always found with me, it had to do with bedrooms. For some reason, I don't know why, but when you get that containment inside of a bedroom and you see like this uber level of violence that takes place in this environment, and there's how I talked about, like, Tracy would have, she's forced down the hallway, there's nowhere for you to go. For the investigators at work, there's no place for you to go. You can't, it's not like you can spin around and catch a breath. When you're introduced into this environment and you're working it and you're documenting it, it's like being in a cell. It really is. And you're contained in this bedroom. And I can tell you right now that within this environment, you're going to have, as we've unfortunately mentioned, you're going to have a lot of smells. There's going to be feces. And that has not necessarily been fully explored and understood, but just feces itself, one of two things happened. Either through humiliation, she was defecated upon, or this is her own feces, and probably presented because she was being raped. And I'm not going to go too far down that road, but you can kind of use your imagination. And then the smearing of the blood that's everywhere. So you're contained within this environment of the horrible smell of feces combined with the metallic, sickly, sweet smell of blood. And then you're seeing all of these, any remnant that's left behind on mattresses, kind of where are the bed linens in here, where are her clothes. You want to make sure that you handle those very carefully, because if she was clothed, first off, does she still have clothing on, or was it ripped from her? And that's one of the things you want to try to understand and contextualize it. And you're having to do it within this very confined space. I don't like confined spaces, and trailers in and of themselves are very difficult to work in.
When police are looking over a scene and there is a mess, I mean, there's no way around this. This is a scene that has body fluid, blood everywhere. And I guess how much are police officers trained when they show up at a crime scene to not mess with everything else that's going on, so that because you have a person who is dead, they're gone. What is the first step that's taken by an officer to prevent that crime scene from getting messed up?
If it's a seasoned officer, if there's anybody else in there after the EMTs have done their thing, which in this case, there would not have been much of a need for an EMT. If the police walks in and you've got early signs of decomposition, the police will, particularly the uniform officer, if they are seasoned, will check for a pulse just to say they did it. And then they're going to have everybody back out. Now, you know how I talked about the negative side of having to work in a confined space? The upside when you're in a structure like this is that you've got containment. And also, you're going to have, it will only accommodate a certain number of people, because one of the most disdainful things in the world are looky-loos. And look, it's not just the general public. People are kind of high and mighty when, and I've heard cops be high and mighty, where they'll say, well, I was driving, these people are driving down the road and they're slowing down. They're looking at the accident. Cops do that too. Don't fool yourself here. All right. There's nothing in that bedroom that some kind of outside person that might happen to have a badge needs to see. If they're not part of that team and you're working in a confined space, you're also going to have the opportunity to keep all of the evidence within that environment if the first officer that arrives identifies the need to shut it down and to back everybody out. That's the key. That's why, in my opinion, I think that uniform officers, beat officers are probably, I think, probably one of the most key elements in any kind of death investigation. Because what they do at the beginning is going to freeze that moment in time. And, look, there's a lot of fragile evidence in here. I know that it's quite disgusting, these things that we've mentioned, Dave, but, you can have, and there's a lot of, obviously, because this is a sexual attack, there's a lot of contact trace in this environment, things that are so fragile that just hair transfers that are there. Back in 2010, when this case took place, not so much would we have thought, I don't think, about touch DNA at that point. Matter of fact, I can almost guarantee that would not have been necessarily on the radar so much. And I'm just thinking about if there's this much blood at the scene, you can actually get handprints that are left behind that are not necessarily going to be associated with the victim, because there's a lot of manipulation of the body. Think about this. Tracy is being subjected to a sexual attack, not at the hand of just one person, but at the hands of two people. So now you have an opportunity, if they have touched the blood, which I don't see how you can avoid not touching it, and you transfer that onto the surfaces of, say, for instance, the sheets, the wall, maybe even onto Tracy's own body as you're trying to manipulate her to get her to do what you want her to do. We've got a male and a female perpetrator. Well, it would stand to reason the female perpetrator's handprint would be smaller than the male, right? So that's a very distinctive thing that we're looking at there that goes to specific identity. So all of these things have to be calculated relative to protection of the scene. But on the more human side of it, when these police officers in Clanton, Alabama, walked into this trailer, Dave, I can tell you, I don't think that they were expecting to see what they saw.
This was a standard, I say standard, where when Tracy didn't show up for work, her employer, called around and said, hey, can we get a welfare check? I mean, that's how many times are we starting stories with that? And yep. And that's what happened here, that she didn't show up for work. And that's why I'm thinking you go and knock on the door. You don't see any forced entry. You don't see any signs of anything. When they finally did get in there to her, they found obviously a horrific mess. I'm a little taken aback by this fantasy idea, which means during the course of interviews with police, they were given an entire story by Osgood and Van Dyke that this is just as despicable as it gets, Joe. That's why we had an actual capital murder. We've got sentenced to death here. So think about that. And by the way, it's a very short time in terms of carrying out the sentence on a death sentence.
I was shocked. Shocked by that, Dave. I'm so glad you brought that up, because most of the time, if you've got somebody that is on death row, these cases are going to go out to infinity, as far as waiting. If you're the family member of a victim and you're wanting lex talionis here, I can't say that every family desires that. However, if it would seem interminably long, like it's never going to come. And in this case, we're 2025, obviously now. I was shocked at, and people might be actually shocked at what I'm about to say. I'm shocked by the fact that they actually did this so soon compared to a lot of other cases that are out there. Like I'd mentioned, I think there's like roughly 165 people on death row in the state of Alabama. He's just one. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that he didn't want to fight anymore. As a matter of fact,
he said, I'm done.
Yeah, he fired. He was, I think that it was, what's the name of the organ? The ACLU. They were providing the attorneys for him, and the ACLU. He fired his ACLU appointed attorney. He's like, I'm over it. I don't want to do this any longer. He said that he has come to an understanding of the idea of an eye for an eye, and that he's ready to pay the price. But one little aside here, Dave. Osgood actually stated that since the murder, torture, let's put it that way, the torture and murder of Tracy back in 2010, he has never spoken her name. And he stated that he felt as though that it would be disrespectful to say her name. And actually, the last thing that he said before the process of lethal injection took place is, "I'm sorry, Tracy. I'm sorry, Tracy." Now, that's no recompense for a life that's been snuffed out. Her child has grown up without her, was already in a bad situation, being away from her mama that far away. And everything that the family, she came to Alabama probably hoping that, people could help her here.
And she was turning it around.
And one of the greatest betrayals that anyone could suffer through, because, we hear a lot about people talking about, what's the term that you hear folks saying about women where they're sexualized and they're put in magazines and all these sorts of things. And this was objectification. This is the worst that you can imagine as far as objectification of a woman. She is truly, when you break that word down, the root is object, right? So object reduces humanity. To me, it does, at least. It's like you take away the humanity, the total and complete humanity and human value of an individual in order to use her for the purposes of this evil desire that you have, this sick, twisted fantasy, which this has been described as.
And Joe,
yeah.
Once they've gotten past the conviction, the crime, and everything else, and now we've got to carry out the sentence. You and I covered the death sentence of another inmate in Alabama, where lethal injection was not used. They used a different form of carrying out the sentence. Was this death carried out in the same way as our previous one, or was this one back to lethal injection? What happened?
In Alabama, you've now got three choices. It's weird to hear that someone has choices, and this is this is not simply in Alabama. You've got a lot of these states now that are looking at other methodologies because, let's face it, lethal injection has been problematic, for years and years now, because pharmaceutical companies don't want to provide the drugs. They're always having to change the formula. And how are you going to do an experiment to try to understand what works best and what is, I'm doing air quotes right now, what is in fact the most humane way to do it? But in Alabama, the electric chair is still on the table. You've got lethal injection. And of course, what you were just referring to is nitrogen hypoxia, which we covered the first case in America that had ever been carried out, and that was here in Alabama. Now there have been a couple. Matter of fact, there was one earlier in the year here in Alabama where another subject that we didn't cover that case, but he met his end through nitrogen hypoxia. For some reason, Osgood chose over hypoxia. He chose to go with the lethal injection. And for, most of these states, they have a protocol that, you have to have it. And what the drug cocktail is going to be. So in Alabama, there's like a three drug administration, where you have one drug that is utilized, and it's utilized therapeutically for many people for anti-anxiety. Given in large enough doses, it's used as an adjunct to anesthesia, where this drug in particular is administered, and it gives you this kind of pharmaceutical induced amnesia where you can't remember surgery. Okay, you can't remember that happened. And once they get you in that sedated state, there'll be another drug that is administered where it is going to begin to compromise your ability to breathe. And it's like a paralytic, which is absolutely horrific, if you're asking me, but you're not going to have an awareness of it because the sedative has been given prior to that. And then finally, it's going to be finished off with potassium chloride. And if you give people a large enough dose of potassium chloride, it screws up the conduction in your heart, and essentially you go in to a state where you're in cardiac arrest and you die. And that's the process that the individual goes through. And if I'm not mistaken, the execution itself was rather uneventful, I think, Dave. There was not some grandiose kind of thing that was going on with this, or, there was not, these huge, shouting and screaming and everything. I think that Osgood had set his mind to this course, and this is just the way things were going to be.
He did. He said, I'm paraphrasing. He said, a couple of years ago, I really messed up. This is it. I don't want he said, if you protest the death penalty, do not use my name on your platform. So he was very direct on this. But Joe, I'm wondering, and I think a lot of people wondered the same thing. When we debate, I say we in the cultural debate,
Yeah, right.
That why not decide this person has been sentenced to death. We're going to carry it out. How about use propofol, put the person to sleep, and then how you kill them is not even germane to the discussion because they're out, they're asleep. They're not. Yeah. They will not come back until you remove the propofol. So don't remove it. Keep them plugged up. Keep it dripping. Boom. Just use the guillotine. I mean, they're asleep.
Well, I think,
they don't feel anything. No. Boom.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying, but the legal eagles out there, when they argue this, most of the time they come from the perspective of it's the anxiety leading up to knowing the drug is coming, and this makes it cruel. For them, they'll say that defines cruel and unusual. And my fallback position has always been relative to victims is that, you might say that's cruel and unusual. I bet I can trump that. I bet I can tell you, let me describe to you what happened to the likes of Tracy, what she went through, back there in that tiny little bedroom where she probably, finally slept, maybe with some level of peace once she began to set down the roots. She had a job. She had thoughts of her daughter. She was proud of a car that she was able to purchase. She had money in her pocket. Sun was rising again for her. But unfortunately, monsters arrived on her doorstep. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.